Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are joining us from today. A hearty jiao to any of our colleagues from China or Taiwan that are joining us today. It's going to be a late one for you if you're still hanging in there today. Um, my name is Joel Drevlo. I'm going to be your trainer for this session on how to code with MAXQDA, which is always a really fun session because there's a ton of different options that you can use to approach this. Um, and it's really sort of why we use the software, right? It's one of the chief sort of functions of all of this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides so I can stay organized here. All right, so you should be looking at my MAXQDA screen. I am starting out today in the example project file. So if you did want to try and follow along with any of this, you can do that. Otherwise, feel free to grab a cup of tea or coffee and sit back and relax. To give you just a quick introduction, just on sort of who I am and sort of so you can understand sort of where I'm coming from as I build out this session today. I'm a MAXQDA certified trainer. I've been using the software for probably about 5-6 years now. I run my own consulting firm, IQDAS Consulting. So I do freelance research as well as training and workshops, stuff like this. My background is primarily in program evaluation. So that's where I used MAXQDA. So I was working at a university and we were analyzing educational outreach programming across the state. So we were looking at programmatic data, survey data, lots of different text data like that, as well as some images and interesting things. So MAXQDA is certainly a very versatile software. You can use it in a lot of different fields. I'm based out of the Boston area. I don't know if anybody else is coming to you from the East Coast of the United States, but if you are, it's a lovely day here in Boston. Alex was telling me it's getting dark already there in Berlin, so it's always fun to see sort of where people are joining us from. Enough of that for the introduction. My email address is listed here. It's also in the handouts, I think, for the session. If you have questions or you want to connect afterwards today, you can find my email there and LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat with people about the work they're doing, answer questions, stuff like that. So reach out. Always good to talk. Our session outline today, I want to kind of jump right into this. There's a lot of content to cover. Most of this is going to be just a live demonstration of various coding techniques, and I'm hoping to get a lot of questions from folks too as we get going through. Again, we'll have that 15 minutes at the end where I'll try and answer those, and I think Alex might try and answer a few of the more the ones that can be answered via text as well during the session. So today we're going to talk in the context of coding, right? So we're talking about how to code data. The first thing that I want to talk about is this concept of data shape. So obviously, very rarely is anybody's project the same in qualitative research. And that's kind of what is interesting, but is also one of the challenging aspects of doing qualitative data analysis is that there's really no two similar projects. The data is different. The research questions are different. The analysts are different. There's different timelines, different products. So there's a whole bunch of variables that we have to consider here. And it can feel kind of squishy sometimes, which is what makes coding a little bit difficult. There's not a confidence interval and some kind of statistic that gets spit out at the end so we can be sure of our results. So we're going to talk about this idea of data shape, long form and short form text. So if you think about analyzing an interview versus analyzing an open-ended survey response. Those are going to be two very different tasks, right? An interview, depending on the length of your interview, I mean, an hour-long interview could be, 20 pages of text? So analyzing that versus analyzing a paragraph in an open-ended response on an evaluation form or something like that is going to be a very different process. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And there are specific tools in MAXQDA that you want to use when you're considering this. So we'll give you an example of that and we'll sort of show you what that would look like. What I'm really going to focus on today is this idea of an iterative coding approach. So iterative just meaning we're going to loop over ourselves. And this is very common in a lot of qualitative methodologies. You'll read something, you'll reread something, you'll read it again. You'll maybe summarize, you'll annotate, you'll code. There's a lot of different steps to the process. And so this is kind of what sets a qualitative method apart from just a reading, right? Anybody can read a text and give you a summary. The method part comes in being very systematic in our approach. So how we have a set process, steps that we use to analyze this data. And so we'll talk about how these iterative coding approaches sort of manifest in MAXQDA, the different tools, the different places that you will get to. So in an earlier session this morning, I talked about conceptualize MAXQDA as a workspace, as a physical workspace, and we're going to think about that same way when we talk about coding, because the idea is in this iterative approach that you'll see different pieces of text. You'll see either a whole interview, you'll see chunks of an interview, you'll see pieces of responses, you'll see words. There'll be different ways to approach this. So that's kind of the idea that we're going to get to today. So with iterative approaches, we'll talk specifically about paraphrasing and annotations. So paraphrasing as an operation, categorizing paraphrases, turning that sort of working that towards a code. We'll talk about annotations in the form of code comments, as well as memos, more so code comments. We will look at sort of preliminary coding operations, specifically the functions, the open coding functions, and then these ideas of sort of broad categorization. So now we're getting into the idea of inductive versus deductive approaches. So open coding is going to be more of an inductive approach where we're generating things. That can be kind of a touchy word sometimes, but generating things from the text and our analysis. And then broad categorization would be more of a, maybe you've done a literature review. Obviously, you're probably somewhat of an expert, if not an expert in the field. And so you already sort of have a hunch of things going in, and that can lead you towards some sort of early categorization. And we'll talk about these ideas of gathering versus subcategorizing. So this is, again, the idea of if I'm open coding, I have many codes, and I'm gathering these codes into a more condensed sort of organized code system versus subcategorizing, where I have maybe broad categories that are basic, and then breaking those categories out to look at sort of subcategories or smaller aspects of that work. So there are two specific tools that we'll look at today, the creative coding tool and the smart coding tool. There may be specific sessions. I know Graham sometimes does specific sessions on those two tools, so you may be able to get a further explanation of that in one of his sessions, but we'll try and give you a good sense of what's capable there. And of course, we'll talk about AI Assist as well. I think Stefan already did a great job of covering the tools that are available to you in his keynote address. So I probably won't do too much there. And I think a lot of the AI Assist in terms of coding still requires manual coding work. So we're going to focus on some of that, but I will try and work this in there and of course answer any questions that you have. All right, so that's it for my session outline. Here again is my contact information. I'll show that again at the end if you need to reach out. Let's go ahead here. All right, so section 1, data, shape, and coding. All right, so if we open up, again, we're in the example project here, and if I open up one of my interviews, for example, you'll see my interview with Salim here. You'll see that I have, 36 paragraphs of text, probably a page or two of data. So this is a pretty brief interview. These are pretty short scripted interviews. But you can see that this is a fairly long document. So it makes sense to process longer documents like this in your document browser. So this window that you see here in MAXQDA. Now, long form documents are typically going to be things like interview transcripts, focus group transcripts. This could also be things like literature. If you're doing a literature review, you could think of that in this way as well, because it's a long form piece of text. Shorter form documents are going to be things like I said, open-ended survey responses, as well as like YouTube comments and things like that. Twitter data, if you can get it, it's a little bit more difficult to get now. We used to have API with Twitter, but unfortunately, that's not the case any longer. So for example, if we take a look at survey data, you'll see in the example project file, I have about 55 survey responses that are included here. And if I open these up, you'll notice a stark difference. These are very short, right? I've only got 3 lines of text, sort of 2 paragraphs. This paragraph is just sort of metadata. This is the actual response from the text. So the process of analyzing this is going to be a lot different. Now, I could do this in my document browser. It's absolutely possible you could do it this way. It's clunky though. If I were to try and analyze these survey responses, I could do my analysis here, then I click, and I get the second one, and I get this next one, and I get this one. And you can absolutely do the analysis that way. That's totally fine. It's just clunky. It's not the sort of the best use of your time. And and I like to stay away from words like efficient. I don't like to view this process as efficient. Um, but just in terms of how you feel doing the analysis, it's not as fun. It's not as easy of a way to do it. Plus, you're missing out on pieces. There is, in the context of a survey, you're asking for the open-ended responses, but you're also asking a number of close-ended responses. So you're getting demographic information, you're getting Likert data on satisfaction or level of understanding, what sort of whatever the topic may be. And you're not able to see all of that here in the document browser. So there's specific tools that you'll want to use to begin to code data like this, right? And we're going to come back to that a little bit later when we look at the smart coding tool. In fact, I might actually just show it to you right now, just so you get a sense of this. So if I were to do this in the document browser, this is what it would look like. If I were to go to my analysis tab at the top, you'll see over here, right in the middle, it's kind of hidden away. There's this option for categorized survey data. And what this will do is it will allow me to look at this in a table format versus as single documents. So if I come here to my survey open-ended questions, a thing to know about this, and if this was more focused on survey data, I would go through this, but when you import survey data, it's auto-coded with just a structural code, basically the question that's asked. So you can see that right here. Why would you spend more time? Why would you spend more time on this particular activity? So this is where they're allowed to give you an open-ended response and expand. If I drag this over, survey open-ended responses, and you'll see I've collected, this is a form where it's nice to gather all of this under a single code. It allows me to get all of this in the table. When I open this up, now when I click here, I get a table with 48 rows, right? So it's a lot simpler for me to go through coding this because I have all of the data in one spot. I don't have to keep going back and forth and clicking through this. Now, for 55 responses, that's not a huge deal. But if you're doing a survey response, or if you have, if you've scraped newspaper articles and you have thousands or tens of thousands of articles, don't do that to yourself. That's not a fun way to process data. You're gonna not enjoy that. So there are more efficient ways. There are specific tools, essentially, is what I'm saying. And so you can then begin to process this data. You can see these things. And if I come up here to my options and I display favorite variables, now I can see things that are included in these survey responses, right? So these other aspects of the data. I could sort this by education. So if I click at the top of my column, now I can look at all the people with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees. I can sort of group this data. So I could have a hunch that people who are belonging to a certain group might have a certain way of responding, or I could have deadlines in my project where I want to look at a certain group first, where I want to prioritize that as I'm doing my data analysis. And so I'm able to do that with the variables. When you're working with an interview, it's not quite the same because it's a single person, right? So in terms of units of analysis, I'm working with 55 responses here. And so the interest here is in that variance, is in the different variables that exist alongside the open text, right? So having my data in a table like this, where I can easily sort and filter based off of that criteria, is going to just offer me another way to literally see my data, right? And so this is something that you'll want to think about as you start to code. What is it that you're trying to see? Are you really trying to just process a whole interview or process a whole document? Are you trying to look for similarities and differences between responses or between pieces of text? Is it helpful to see things in the same viewing space? And if you don't know, right, if you don't have an answer to that question right away, try it both ways. See which way is more effective to you. I won't say that there's any best way to do this. There is a best way for you and a best way for your project at that point in time. And that's sort of what you want to be trying to find. All right, so that kind of takes us through this idea. If we go back to our notes here, takes us through this idea of long form versus short form text. I want to get into this kind of idea of iterative coding approaches. And I've got about 15 minutes to get through this. I had a show and tell planned. I don't know if I'll get to my show and tell. I live in an old house here in Boston, and I do a lot of renovation on my house. And I was going to show you some of my tools, but I think I'm going to skip that for today and just sort of get into the functions. The idea that I want to try and communicate with this is that, again, just like we saw using the categorized survey data tool, there are specific tools for specific tasks. Let me just show you one easy example. I brought up my tools. I should show them off. So I do a lot of plaster work in my house, and there are specific tools. You use this 4-inch knife to spread plaster on the wall. If you've ever done that, maybe you've hated it, maybe you enjoy it. I happen to really enjoy it. It's kind of a meditative practice for me. But you've got this 4-inch knife to control things like when you're taping a joint, right, with mud or with plaster on the wall. When you get into the corners, you have this specific tool that's shaped for the corners. So you have specific tools that you use for specific tasks, right? Now, I could use this tool for everything, right? I could do the whole job with this tool. It would suck, and I wouldn't enjoy that process, and it probably wouldn't come out as nice. So the idea here is not that you couldn't use the document browser to analyze all of your survey data. It's that you would not have a fun time doing it that way. So that's kind of the idea I want to get across. I'm bummed I had way more tools to show you. I like to show off my tools, spend money on them and collect them, and it's fun to show them off in these um, webinars. But the idea here is that there's an iterative process to this as well, in that as you work with this, you use different tools in different steps. You do a first coat. You literally have to wait overnight for that mud to set before you can do a second coat, right? So there's a process to this, an iterative process to this. You can't just do it all in one step. You can, but it's going to look bad. And so the idea is to be patient with this process, as difficult as that can be sometimes. We're all on increasingly cramped deadlines these days. So let's go through some of these iterative approaches. I want to show you some of these sort of in the text. I'm going to actually open up another project. I made just a blank project here. Let's see. Coding project, was it this one? Yeah. So I took Salim's interview out of the work-life balance project, and I just copied it over blank so that we have a sort of a blank project to work with, and so we can start to build up some of this coding. I want to go through a few of these iterative pieces here. We're going to start out with sort of paraphrasing and annotation. So paraphrasing is a really great way. If you are new to qualitative data analysis, I think it's a very good way to start in this process, because it's not so rigid. It's much more open. Paraphrasing functionally is a quite simple activity. In your document browser, if I open up an interview, and you can click along with me if you feel so inclined here, you can open up Salim's interview and try this out. You'll see at the top here, there's this option, this orange bubble here, paraphrase mode on off. So you see the paraphrase mode is actually a toggle. It's like a light switch. It's got to be on or off. So if I turn this on, you'll see that that stays highlighted. It maybe is difficult to see on your screen, but it remains gray like this. And what this allows me to do is highlight a portion of text. And let's just, here's a little trick for you. If I click the number 3, it'll highlight that whole paragraph of text, save me having to drag my cursor across. Now it's going to open up this window where it's going to give me 511 characters to paraphrase this portion of text. So the idea here is it's very open. I don't have to have a 3 or 4 word code name or concept or idea to categorize this information. I'm not limited by that. I can write about whatever I see. So basically, the idea here is to restate this in your own words. And I find that this process is a great way to actually know your data. If you read through like Braun and Clark's thematic analysis, this is kind of akin to like the idea of familiarization. You are getting to know your data in a sense. You'll also see the AI assist options are here, so you can get an AI generated summary. I encourage you to test those out. An easy way to compare this is to do some summaries on your own and to do some AI assist summaries. It's not necessarily whether the summaries are accurate or inaccurate, because we've done a lot of testing to make sure they're accurate. It's whether or not it's jiving with what you need out of this work, if the summaries are giving you what you need. So you can definitely try this process out to kind of get these summaries. But the idea of a paraphrase here is that I can sort of go through and read this and get a sense of it. So we could say here, in this paragraph, Salim talks about his morning routine. We might notice, for example, preparing food for his daughter is an important part, right? So this is just done on the fly. So this probably isn't a great summary. You want to take some more time with this, but the idea here is to condense this. In some cases, one sort of practical usage of this in survey data is if you've said that you won't use respondents' direct text, but you will paraphrase that text, this is a great way to do that. So you can actually sort of take quotes or sentiments from this, but it doesn't contain necessarily identifying text from people. So that can be a helpful thing as well. But the idea here is you create a number of paraphrases. Let's go on and do number 7 here. Actually, let's open this one back up and let's delete this. Let's do an AI assist and see what it comes up with. And so essentially this will send the data out to the language model, and it will give us a summarization or a paraphrase of this piece of text. See how fast my internet connection is today. All right, typical workday, wake up at 5:30. So it's got basically the pieces here. Now, if you're familiar with the work-life balance project, typical workday is a code. It becomes a code. The idea is that we're working in a systematic fashion. We're working in a step-by-step process. We don't jump right to typical workday. We use the summarized process as a way to get there. So if I do this, let's do this a couple more times. Let's just put some demo text here, just to show you what this looks like. Some additional text goes here. All right, so I've got 3 paraphrases done. Now that I have these paraphrases created, I can turn this off. I can come up to my paraphrase options. This is under the analysis tab. Come up to these paraphrases options, and I can categorize paraphrases. So what this does now is the same menu we saw earlier, right, with the categorized survey data. You'll see this again with categorized paraphrases, but here I have the actual, my paraphrases, what I've written. Now, if I want to, I can click this option and I can display the text as well. And so I can see the actual text. If I need a reference, right, if I want to check my paraphrases, I can do that. But then what I can do is I can create codes from this. So I see typical workday here. I'll come over to my codes tree. I'll create this code for typical workday, and I will assign it here. And you'll see now codes, typical workdays in this column. I have 1 segment on typical workday. If I close out of this menu, you'll see typical workday exists over in my code system. So the idea here is that you're not making leaps, or you're trying to avoid making leaps, right? So you have this idea of a summarization to get to the code. Now, I would not recommend doing this for your whole project. If you have a series of maybe like 10 interviews, maybe do this for the first 2 or 3. And then you develop a code system. Now you've developed a code system, you have a firm understanding of what these codes are, what they mean, when they're applied, when they're not applied, and the application of those codes is going to be more consistent, and it's going to be a lot easier for you as you move on throughout the project, right? So again, this is kind of a step-by-step process. We're working incrementally to get to the codes that we build out. So that's one option, paraphrasing. Now, if we want to do this in a similar fashion without paraphrasing, but with annotations, I could use my highlighter tool. So I could come in here and I could say, okay, well, paragraph 7 has something interesting in it. Let's highlight this green. I like green. And the highlighter just essentially means there's something of interest here. Richard Boyatzis talks about this in, what is it, The Practice of Qualitative Data Analysis? I think that's the MAXQDA book. I can't remember the title of the book off the top of my head, but he makes a distinction between noticing something that you need to code and then coding it, right? And so the highlight function is the noticing bit, right? I see something here that's important. I see something I want to categorize that I want to keep noted. And so the highlighter serves that function. Then the annotation, or in this case, the code comment, if I double click this green stripe, it's going to give me this field where I can now create an annotation here. So talks about flexibility in the context of, let's see, arranging appointments. Okay. And if I need to come over to my sidebar here, right click is an action used a lot in MAXQDA, turn on my comments, and now I have this available to me. So I can just go through and highlight things of interest, things of note, and I can annotate what it is that's notable there. And it gives me more space. I don't have to have a single specific topic or category or idea or theme. I can just be more open here. And I have these things highlighted in that color. They're annotated with this. I can then look at these later. If I come back and I double click on green, I'll get an overview of retrieved segments, right? And I can see all these things and I can see all of my annotations in my previews in the same place. So I could look at all 20, 30, 40 segments of green that I have, right? And I can start to look uh, via my comments. I see flexibility appears 5 times, right? Well, that's a pretty good indication that I should have a flexibility code, right? And so the idea is that, again, systematic, step by step. I'm not just sort of making an assumption here. I'm basing this off of the data. You can talk about reliability or those kinds of things. I don't like to use that kind of language when I'm talking about this work because it can be quite subjective. But the idea is that it's not noise, right? This isn't just random. This is some kind of pattern that we're seeing here. So that would be another way that you could work on an iterative approach. Let's talk a little bit about some of the preliminary code with the open coding tool. So this is similar to highlight and paraphrase. So if I wanted to do this, it's up here at the top, the open coding mode, just like paraphrase, this is a toggle on off. And so you see it's on now. Now, if I were to highlight, let's say paragraph 11, it's going to automatically open up the menu for me to create a new code. And so I might see, what did I see here? I think I saw flexible in here before, right? Outside appointments. Say I have more time for family. All right, let's say time for family. And again, this is going to be heavily dependent on what your research question is and what you're looking for. In my code memo, I want to include a definition. I want to include examples. I want to include when to code and when not to code. Oftentimes, those are more powerful examples. And I can also create an annotation. So this might be keywords, but I would recommend full sentences. You won't remember keywords, trust me. I think I'll remember keywords and I never do. So write full sentences. If I click OK, watch what happens. New code, time for family. It has a memo. It has one coded segment, and that segment has been annotated, right? So you could do this line by line, right? You could start creating your code system, and chances are you'll generate hundreds of codes, right? Once I've generated all of these codes, now I need another tool, right? I need another tool to organize those codes. And so if I go to my codes menu, I have this creative code menu, right? So now I can drag all of my codes in here and I can start to reorganize these, right? So I can literally drag them around. I can say, okay, well, time for family and typical workday, these are related. I've only got 3 codes, so this isn't terribly interesting, but you can start to literally group these things. I can define these as subcodes, right? So now typical workday is a subcode or it's an aspect of time for family. So I can start to sort of create the relationships of these. And the idea here is that you have a specific workspace for a specific task. The document browser is where I view the whole transcript, where I do all of the sort of initial thinking. And the creative coding menu is where I organize all of that thinking, right? It breaks this analytical thinking task into 2 clearly separate pieces, right? Well, maybe not separate, but separate tasks, right? Separate tasks of the whole. And so the idea here is that you're making it easier on yourself. You're not trying to do everything in one swoop. Now, when you get more experience with this and when you've done a lot of this, you could probably do that. I've seen people do it, and some people are very, very talented at this kind of analysis. But for us mere mortals, it's helpful to have these tools where we're able to sort of focus our attention and our energy on a specific task. Running short on time, always running short on time. Let me show you just a couple more tools. I want to show you the other aspect of this. So we looked at the open coding mode. I want to show you sort of this broad categorization in general. So if I'm doing this analysis, right, I created these interview scripts, which is really your first part of coding, the questions that you chose. I've created these scripts. I've done a literature review. I have an idea of what's there, right? It's fairly. I'm pretty certain that it's going to be there. I can create some of my code system in advance. If I come over here to my code system, you'll see this little plus icon, new code. I know, right, the process, the questions I'm asking specifically about typical workday, right? I'm asking that explicit question. I know that's a code, right? So I can create typical workday. I can drag it up here. I know that I'm going to be asking about work-life balance. It's one of the questions that I've asked in the interview, so I can create that in advance. And I can start to essentially when I find a reference to it, got to turn off the open coding mode. When I find a reference to this, I can drag it in here, right? And I've got another one here, and I can drag it in here. Okay, and I've got another one, and I can drag it in here. Now, I'm not worried about what specific aspect of work-life balance this is. It's just associated with work-life balance, right? And now I will come to my smart coding tool, right? And I'll click on work-life balance, and now I've got all three of my segments here for work-life balance, right? So I'm able to see all of these pieces of text. Now, this could also be images or video clips, audio clips. It could be anything. Where text is easy. This is why we're focusing on that. I've got all of these things here, and if I've done what I should have been doing, I've got annotations here in my comments column as well. And now I'm able to subcategorize this. I'm able to look at this and say, okay, well, this is typical workday, but what's the or work-life balance, but this is what aspect of this is referenced here. And so I see housework is mentioned, right? So maybe I found that housework is an aspect. So I'm going to go to this line of this code. I'm going to click plus, and I'm going to add in this subcode for housework, and I'll drag it over here, right? And now housework exists on this as well. So the idea, again, we're using a specific tool for a specific task. Now, I could have done this in my document browser. I could have coded it right there. I could have built that out. But what I'm able to see here is that I'm working in a sort of a specific fashion. I'm choosing a specific process that I want to use to process all of my data. And that's the key thing, process all of your data, right? So it's consistent across everything that you have in your project. So this would be sort of the opposite. If we looked in our session outline, we talked about this open coding mode and this broad categorization. The idea here is we're sort of working in different directions, right? I'm starting with many codes at the outset, and I'm condensing them into sort of broader categories, which may become themes, or I'm starting with those big picture items, those bigger buckets that might be my categories or themes, and I'm breaking them out about the smaller pieces that constitute them. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this, but there is a way that's going to make sense for your research question and just for your sort of preferred analytical mind. How do you want to process this? What makes more sense to your brain? And really, you should probably try both. And honestly, you'll probably do both. You'll probably have some codes that you'll create at the beginning to process, and you'll find things as you go, right? If I were to find in this that something that's not mentioned yet, I can highlight it and right click, and I can create a new code right here from my context menu. It's that easy. So you can see how MAXQDA is very flexible to accommodate a wide range of thinking in terms of how you want to begin to process this data. All right, so that is 3 minutes past my 30 minutes. So I'm going to switch over to the questions here and see what we've got. All right, let me find the Q&A option, Q&A panel. All right, question. I have 12 surveys and 60 interviews. How can I deal with the coding process? Would it be creating a project for the surveys and another for the interviews? I wouldn't do 2 separate projects. It's nice to have them all in the same thing. Chances are that some of the codes will be used for both. This is kind of an interesting one. In some ways, you've got a little bit of a mixed methods possibility here. There's some interesting sort of literature there. Cresswell, of course, has a really good explanation of the different approaches that you might take. Do you do the interview first and then supplement with the survey? Do you do the survey first and supplement with the interview? So you'll want to think about it in that context. You can do it all at once as well. That can be kind of messy. But yeah, you can process them in the same thing. And like I said, you might use some of the same code if it's the same people, if it's the same research questions and those kinds of things. I wouldn't necessarily do it in 2 separate projects, though. The idea of having a project file is that you can have everything in one space. So by separating the two, you kind of remove the ability to see any of the similarities and comparisons that you can make there. So I wouldn't put them in two separate projects. Hopefully that helps answer your question a little bit. Does paraphrasing also work with the Goya method, a methodology? I'm not familiar with that methodology, so I'm not sure. Um, um, Basically, the idea there is that you, with paraphrasing, is again that it's an open framework, and you have those the ability to use sort of your initial summarizations or paraphrases. Summarizations is usually coded material, but you're able to use your paraphrases to build the code. And so this might be when you want to take a very sort of open approach to letting the data inform some of that coding process. I'm sorry that I'm not familiar with that process, that I can't better answer that question for you. What's the difference between in vivo and new coding? Yeah, good question. I get asked about in vivo a lot. In vivo coding, basically whatever you highlight, it creates the code name. So let's see if I can find a good example. It's hard because still need a lot of time. He comes home. Okay, this one's kind of fun. Daddy always comes home at the same time. Let's do that. If I highlight this portion of text, Daddy always comes home at the same time, and I right click, I get the option for in vivo coding. So watch what happens here. If I click this, you'll see I get a code that's created. It's titled Daddy always comes home at the same time. And this segment, just this portion of text, is coded as that. So in vivo coding, basically you take the exact language that's used by the speaker, and it is the code name as well as the coded content, right? So this is typically used for very evocative language or emotional language, where the speaker essentially defines the thing better than you could as a researcher, right? There's a pretty famous example of this in the early grounded theory literature, where they're working with nurses in a hospital, and there's specific language that they use to refer to people that they actually sort of used. It stands in as the code name essentially. Um, I don't use in vivo coding a whole lot. It's just not part of the analysis that I do. I'm a evaluator most of the time. It's, we do quotes and things occasionally, but essentially whatever you highlight becomes the name of the code. Now, keep in mind that like if you highlight a whole paragraph of text, it's going to get cut off. There's a character limit in MAXQDA. I think it's like 160 characters. Maybe Alex has a better knowledge of that than I do. But the idea is that whatever you highlight becomes the code name. Right. So typically you use that for more powerful language that might stand in for an emotion or a concept or something like that. Hopefully that gives you a sense there. Oh, she's working on a nursing project. Awesome. Maybe you can actually put that to use. When working in two different languages for comparison, is it best to have all the data in one or two different documents? Ooh, that's a good question. When working in two different languages for comparison, is it best to have all the data in one or two different documents? You could probably do two. Let me open up my example project here. One thing in MAXQDA, so let's open up Mateo's interview. If I right click on Salim's interview and I go to this option for open document in separate window, you'll see that I can actually display two documents side by side. So I could do it that way. If I had a two monitor setup, which I do have here in my office, you could have two on two different screens. So I think that might be nice that way. I've never done it. I can't speak from experience. My Chinese is not good enough to do quantitative data analysis. But yeah, I would experiment maybe a little bit to see which one works better for you. But you can have the two windows up at the same time. Maybe you could do it that way. I guess it would come down to how you want to see the relationships between the codes. If there's an interplay there between the two languages, then you'd want to have them probably in the same document so that you can see the overlap. It might be a little simpler to set it up that way, but that's a really good question. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you there. Are there any particularities when it comes to coding ethnographic field notes? I pretty much followed all the steps you so brilliantly took us through. I am just curious if you have any recommendations for huge amounts of text field notes. Are there any particularities when it comes to coding ethnographic field notes? I don't I guess I don't have anything in that particular context. Um, the best advice I can give you with coding is just documentation. That's such a huge part of this. So your code memos are huge, right? The code definitions and those kinds of things. As long as you're doing, as long as you're thorough there with your code memos and with your annotations of coded segments when necessary, I think you're in good shape. The nice part about annotations is it's work as you go, but one of the really nice things with that is that when you get to do the actual write-up, it's there. You've already done the work. It really is that bit by bit process, and so you're not, again, that analogy of big leaps where you're seeing something and you're making taking larger steps to get there. I think can sometimes trip people up. And so as long as you're capturing things in your code memos that you've used to code the data and any annotations, you should be good. If your field notes come in the forms of memos, one thing to be aware of, if I right click a memo, I can turn a memo into a document, and then I can code it so I can actually analyze it. So that's a thing that you might want to be aware of. It's kind of a fun thing to try out. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit. One last thing we just a couple minutes left. I don't think I see any other questions in the Q&A. Feel free to drop any more in there if you still have questions. One thing that I always like to do when I start coding is I will create a code at the top of my code system called unsure, something to that effect, unsure, don't know. And so if I'm coding and I see something in this paragraph like, wow, that's really good, but I don't know where that goes yet, I will put it in unsure. And then I will come back and periodically I will reevaluate. Because chances are, after I've coded the rest of the document or coded another document, I've come upon a way to categorize this now. And so I have the framework. I have the analytical framework to be able to process that when I didn't before. So that can be a really helpful tool. I like to do that. Also, good quotes is always a great one. Things that you want to pull text directly from what your interviewees have said. That's a good one as well. And you can see this is actually a highlighter that was turned into a code. So you can actually rename your highlighted codes. Well, it looks like the last question here. Do you have any publications or resources for beginners who need to learn fast? I'm a PhD student trying to finish. Yeah, check out MAXQDA Press. There is some great resources in there. There's some handbooks that are on specific topics. If you're working with survey data or interviews, focus group data, there's a ton of resources on YouTube. Johnny Saldana has a bunch of free YouTube lectures that he's talked about coding that I think are really helpful. Tons of great trainers here at MAXQDA to check out the trainer network. Folks like me do consultations where you can book time with us and we can take a look at your project as well. So you can definitely seek out those options. But yeah, there's tons of resources on YouTube and other things like that. I think there's a free course, or not a free course, but a learning course as well through MAXQDA that you could definitely check out. So hopefully that's helpful. But we're right up at time here, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here. Thank you, everybody, for such great questions here at the end. These were really good. You stumped me even a couple times. And I hope that this session was helpful for you to see some of the different ways that you can begin to code and process data. Again, let me just see if I have it here. Here's my contact information one last time. Feel free to reach out, LinkedIn, email, my website if you want to chat after the session. We'd love to hear from you. So, but I'll go ahead and stop here. Enjoy the rest of the day, whether it's day or night, wherever you are. So we'll hopefully see you again tomorrow.